Okay, so today we are going to have a discussion about how public opinion affects foreign policy in the United States. So, the first part of the lecture, I'm going to talk to you more theoretically about how this works. So, stay with me. It's going to be a bit more, abstract, but I think it'll make sense at the end. And then we're going to talk more about how public opinion is translated into policy through elites and interest groups. So that will be the second part of today's talk. So first, let's talk about the theoretical part, which is how public opinion works and how and why it would actually influence the formation of policy. So if we're going to assume that public opinion has some influence over security policy and foreign policy in the United States, the first question I think is, what is it that the American public actually wants? And that's an interesting question. I think there are lots of beliefs that there are things that the U.S. public wants, and I think there are many things that we sort of hold as common ideas that the U.S. wants or that Americans generally want. For example, I think we could believe that most Americans want peace, that they prefer a world where the United States is not fighting several wars at a time, where the United States is not engaged in territorial aggression, where the United States doesn't attack other countries. And based on some of the opinion data we saw yesterday, we do see some evidence for that for the most part, the American public seems to not favor being aggressive, whereas elites in the United States do seem to be more aggressive than just the general public. If that's true, what we would expect is that the US public's opinion, which is favoring more peaceful outcomes, should translate into policy. So that might be something we could conceive of that the American public wants. A second thing that the US public might want is support for free trade. Now, that's interesting because that's partially true. It seems like most Americans, based on the data, support some form of free trade. It also seems that many Americans support what's called fair trade, which is the idea that other countries reduce tariff barriers, etc., if the United States is going to do so. But generally, most Americans are open to the idea that the United States should be trading with other countries. So maybe that's something else that the American public wants. Two other aspects that we can think about as to what the American public wants is, does the United States favor the spread of democracy? I would imagine that's probably true. How that's done might vary, and what democracy looks like might vary, but generally in principle, I don't think the United States is opposed to the idea that, or I don't think Americans are opposed to the idea that democratic values should spread, or that democratic values have some superiority to autocratic values. That seems to be something that's embedded in American political consciousness. And finally, most Americans have this idea that there should be non-aggression, that states should not try to attack other states and try to seize their assets or seize their territory, right? So those things seem to be basic ideas that are in the American political consciousness that most members of the American public may want, right, in terms of what they're pursuing in foreign policy. But what's interesting is that if we examine these aspects, there are several contradictions in them, right? So first of all, if we think about the spread of democracy, during the Cold War and during the War on Terror, the United States was perfectly willing to support many, many non-democracies throughout the world. If we just look at the Vietnam War as an example of this, and this is also breaking the idea of territorial aggression, the United States, upon seeing that communist forces were going to take control of Indochina and of Vietnam, the United States supported an imperial power, France, in reestablishing its empire. When that failed, the United States advocated for breaking what would become Vietnam into two entities, one in the north, one in the south. And in the south, the United States supported Ngoc Dinh Diem, who was a Catholic leader that was incredibly repressive towards his largely Buddhist population. And Diem was, by all accounts, a dictatorial leader. And he's certainly not alone, right? The United States has supported several non-democracies. You could also point to the Wahhabi Kingdom in Saudi Arabia with the effort to try to achieve its foreign policy goals in the War on Terror. that's not consistent with American ideals, but those were popular policies. Again, that's interesting because they were popular, yet they contradict sort of the basic fundamental bedrock of the United States, which is the United States should be spreading democracy. Again, we can also look at some other aspects of this, such as this idea of free trade, right? The United States frequently advocates for free trade, but often demands for managed trade or what it calls fair trade. So when companies start to suffer from competition, such as when U.S. Steel suffered from competition from Chinese imports of steel, American firms demanded protection, and it was seen as something that was reasonable for the United States to intervene in the market. When I was growing up in the 1980s, that was a time where American automobile manufacturers were facing pretty considerable competition from Japanese automobile manufacturers, and it was just doesn't see it as anything wrong as trying to protect the big three in the United States, the big three automakers with tariffs. That was seen as patriotic even, but that's not consistent with the ideals of free trade, where consumers make the choices as to what types of companies should live or fall under. So that's also not consistent. We can then go a little bit further down, right? If we think about this idea of non-aggression, it's been consistent in the American ethos that the United States defends countries. It doesn't engage in attacks. It doesn't engage in aggressive wars. It doesn't do the types of things that expansionist powers do. But it's pretty hard to argue empirically, again, if we look at just the data and we're objective, that the United States is not an aggressive power based on the data, which are the correlates of war data and other data sources. It's pretty clear that since 1945, no country has initiated more military action than the United States. You can make a justification that that's reasonable, but that's true. The United States uses force more than any other country. And we can look at an example like Iraq, where the United States engaged in what clearly appears to be territorial aggression. Again, justified or non-justified, the United States attacked this sovereign country, deposed its leadership, and established a temporary governance over that country. That, again, empirically is an act of aggression, and that violates this idea of non-aggression. And that, even though several policymakers made the case that that was a unique thing that the United States did, that it hadn't done that before, that just simply also is not true, right? If we look at the U.S. experience prior to that, in 1898, the United States declared war on Spain and took control of several Spanish territories, such as Cuba and the Philippines, right? That also meets the definition of engaging in aggressive territorial expansion. And I think one area that's frequently overlooked is how the United States has behaved towards Native American civilizations throughout its history. I think if you really dig into the history of the U.S. expansion westward, it's often portrayed that Native American civilizations were just landless and nomadic and roaming the Western United States that was basically ungoverned. That empirically is not true. Empirically, if you look at the data and you look at the history, it appears that many of these Native American civilizations resembled states. They weren't officially states because that wasn't a concept for many of the tribes. But they did resemble states, and the United States systematically broke every treaty it made with them and expanded westward and engaged in behaviors that today look fairly shameful. All right, so it's pretty hard to argue that that was consistent with American political ethos. Now, that's, again, these are behaviors, right? These are things we've observed in the United States. The ethos of the United States, the ideals of the United States are perfectly reasonable. But what we see here is how they're interpreted and how they're implemented and how they're examined at any one moment in time. That may vary, right? It's perfectly true that in the late 19th century, Americans did not favor territorial aggression, but they did not view Native Americans as being states. So what we can see is that the ideals of the United States sometimes contradict what the United States actually does in terms of its behavior. So that raises this question: what does the public want, right? Each of these policies in the past, when we look at them, like challenging China on free trade, attacking Iraq and Saddam Hussein, those were popular policies. there was considerable public support behind them, even though it violates these basic ideas that we think that the public actually wants. So if we ask ourselves, what is it that Americans want? Who are they? What are their preferences? I think what we can conclude is that that's not immediately obvious, right? And I think we can also conclude that it's unclear if the public has any sort of rational preferences, right? Any sort of aggregate rational preferences. Now, let's try to figure that out. The first thing to do is to figure out, what do we mean when we say that a public is rational? When I say rational, I think many of you, what comes to mind is this idea of sanity. That if someone is sane, they are rational. That's not how we typically interpret that term in political science. In political science, rationality simply means this definition right here, which is that you have ordered and transitive preferences. So if you are a rational actor, you can identify preferences amongst different outcomes, and you can rank those preferences, and you can keep them consistent, and you can maintain some transitivity. So transitivity means that if you prefer A to B and you prefer B to C, then it must be true that you also prefer A to B, and it must be true that you also prefer A to C. Sorry for the typo here, right? So if we think about it this way, right, one way we can look at outcomes is if we think about baseball. I like baseball analogies because it's one of my favorite sports. So as weird as it may seem to many of you, I'm a big Yankees fan. So my preference is that the Yankees beat the Detroit Tigers. I developed an affinity for the Detroit Tigers at my time in Michigan. My other preference is that the Detroit Tigers beat the Red Sox. The Red Sox winning the World Series is my absolute worst outcome. If it's true that I prefer the Yankees beating the Tigers and I prefer the Tigers beating the Red Sox, it must be true that I prefer the Yankees beating the Red Sox. And I do, right? And so if that's the case, I am a rational actor. As long as if I prefer A to B and I prefer B to C, it must be true that I prefer A to C. As long as that is true, I'm a rational actor. Now, what's interesting here is I can have bizarre preferences, right? I can have preferences that might seem odd. Those baseball preferences may well seem odd to many of you, but that doesn't matter. All that matters is that I can keep them ordered and transitive. So take, for example, if I were a racial terrorist, right, my preferences might be to kill all African Americans. My second preference might be to kill all Latinos, and my third preference might be to kill all Asians, right? And what that would suggest is that I prefer killing African Americans to killing Latinos. I prefer killing Latinos to killing Asians, and therefore it must be true that I prefer killing African Americans to killing Asians. These are horrible preferences. These are terrible preferences. These are, for many of you, homicidal and insane preferences. That is perfectly reasonable to object to that on a moral level, and you should. But when we apply this particular rational actor framework, those preferences can be incorporated into this rational actor framework, and we can understand the behavior of that particular racial terrorist using the rational actor model. You can apply this to any leader that's out there. And as long as they can identify their preferences over outcomes, and as long as they can keep those preferences ordered and transitive, whoever they are may be considered a rational actor. This also applies to several bad actors throughout history, right? You can look at Saddam Hussein in this way. You can look at Pol Pot in this way. You can look at Joseph Stalin in this way. As long as they can identify a set of outcomes, no matter what those outcomes are, and as long as they can keep them ordered and transitive, they can be considered rational actors. Now, taking a step back from those leaders, because those leaders are not people we want to emulate, and they certainly are not leaders that are representative of what the American public may want. Ideally, if we want the American public to be treated as rational actors, they have to fulfill three general properties. One, what we want is for the American public to demonstrate complete and transitive preferences, right? They have to be ordered and they have to be transitive. Two other properties that we want out of the American public's decision-making is that we want American decision-making to be non-dictatorial. It shouldn't be one person makes all the decisions for the entire American public, right? We want the American public. We want individuals to make choices. We want them to contribute to the collective social choice, right? That if we go back to Tocqueville, this was a key aspect of the United States, that non-elites make decisions, and that the entire polity makes a decision together. And third, consistent with that, is we want to be able to have the American public exhibit something that looks like majority rule, right? It should not be one voice is imposing their view over everybody else. So we want majority rule. Again, we want to demonstrate rationality. We want to be able to demonstrate that the public has complete order and transitive preferences. We want this decision-making process to be non-dictatorial, and we want it to be the case that it has majority rule. So let's think about how that may work. Let's assume a simple decision where we're making a public choice as to how the United States should behave towards Iran. For simplicity, let's assume there's three Americans. There's Fred, Wilma, and Barney. These might sound familiar. There's Fred, Wilma, and Barney. The three of them have to define U.S. policy on Iran. If we can apply to these three, we can apply to an N voter setting. Now let's assume there are three options just so we can simplify this. On one hand, the United States can continue its current status quo policies towards Iran. On the other hand, the United States can choose to attack Iran and try to depose the regime and change the regime that's in Tehran. The third option is for the United States to abandon the region completely, just to abandon its defense commitments to any of its allies against Iran and to stop engaging in the Middle East. So there's actually, in reality, an infinite number of policies that the United States could adopt for simplicity and to try to make some social choice. Let's assume there are these three: status quo, attack, or leave the region. So let's look at the preference orderings for our three Americans, Fred, Wilma, and Barney. They all have different preferences, as we might expect in the American public, right? Fred prefers to attack Iran to maintain the status quo, but Fred prefers to maintain the status quo to withdraw. That's probably consistent with some Americans that are out there. Wilma, on the other hand, prefers to maintain the status quo and prefers to maintain the status quo to withdrawing from the Middle East. But Wilma would prefer to withdraw from the Middle East rather than initiate a war against Iran and attack. On the other hand, Barney just wants to get out of the Middle East. That's Barney's top preference. But rather than just completely withdrawing from the Middle East, if the United States is going to stay, Barney prefers to attack rather than maintaining the status quo. According to Barney, the status quo is unsustainable. So the United States needs to either get out of the Middle East, which is Barney's top preference, or needs to attack. So those are our three preference orderings. If we look at this a bit closely, let's see what the collective prefers. They should just have a vote, right? So let's see, does the collective group of Americans prefer attacking to the status quo? Well, what we can see is that Fred certainly prefers attacking to the status quo. So that's one vote for attack. Wilma's the opposite, prefers the status quo to attacking. So that's one vote for maintaining the status quo over attacking. And then if we look at Barney, Barney also prefers to attack to maintain the status quo. So it's 2-1. Fred and Barney prefer attacking to the status quo over Wilma. So we would think that the collective, the United States collective here, if they're represented by these three voters, should prefer attacking to maintaining the status quo. So that's our first choice. Americans should prefer attacking to maintaining the status quo. Now let's look at, should the United States maintain the status quo relative to withdrawal, or does the United States prefer to maintain, or does the United States prefer withdrawing to maintain the status quo? We can see that Fred prefers maintaining the status quo to withdrawing. Wilma prefers maintaining the status quo to withdrawing, and Barney prefers withdrawing to maintaining the status quo. So we know that the American public prefers attacking to maintaining the status quo, and the American public prefers maintaining the status quo to withdrawing. That's what these two, since these two votes tell us. But let's look at, does the American public prefer withdrawing to attack? Well, Fred doesn't. Fred prefers to attack versus withdraw. But let's look at Wilma. Wilma prefers to withdraw over attacking, and so does Barney. So withdraw beats attack. Now, if that's confusing, it should be, because attack beat maintain the status quo, beating maintain the status quo, or maintaining the status quo beat withdrawing, but withdrawing beats attack. And so what that tells us, if this is our three orders, attack beats the status quo beats withdraw, and withdraw beats invade, these preferences are not transitive. These preferences are not, they're ordered, but they're not transitive. In terms of their binary relationships, what we see is that the American public exhibits a preference ordering that is not transitive. and if it's not transitive, is therefore irrational. Now, that should be somewhat weird for many of you, because what this is suggesting, even if we break this issue down into a very simplistic framework, into three possible options with only three voters, what we see is this thing falls apart, that the American public cannot form an ordered and transitive preference ordering, which means that it's irrational. Right, and that's interesting, because if we were to expand it, it would get worse, right? The whole problem would get worse. We would see even more intransitivities. And so what this tells us collectively is that the American public is not what you would call rational, right? The American public is not rational in this sense. Individually, they may be rational. Americans may be rational. They may be able to keep their preferences ordered and transitive. Collectively, they do not. Collectively, as a whole, they do not. With only three people, there's no consistent transitive preference ordering. And if we add more than three people, this will almost certainly get worse, right? And we can demonstrate this just based on experimental work. So the conclusion that comes out of this, which you can take it as disturbing or not, is that the American people do not have a rational preference ordering. Now, that's not unique to the United States. No collective polity has a rational preference ordering if we allow it to be democratic, right? If we allow it that there should be no dictator and there should be some form of majority rule, every collective decision which has multiple choices here will have problems, right? They all will. So it's not just the United States being irrational, it's mass publics tend to be irrational here. So how can this be? Right, it's weird for us, I think, because we tend to believe that Americans have shared values, right? That there are some things that Americans hold consistent. But if we look at this exercise, it might explain why we see inconsistencies, right? It might explain why Americans are sometimes anti-territorial aggression, but tolerate territorial aggression. It might explain why Americans are pro-free trade, but yet tolerate protectionism, right? It might explain these contradictions in the United States. And it's because there really is no core set of values that all Americans tend to follow, right? We're able to find these contradictions. And we can see that even if we have very, very strong assumptions that try to impose collective rationality, we still get no collective rationality. So what does this tell us, right? Does this just tell us that the American public, that there's just nothing there, there's nothing to follow? Well, let's change it up a little bit. Let's go through the exercise slightly differently. Let's assume that one of these individuals is the president, and just for simplicity, let's make it Fred. So suppose Fred is the president. Well, from last time, remember Fred, if he's president, gets to set the agenda. So what Fred can do is to try to set the agenda, set the choices available to the rest of the public so that they agree with him, right? So we can see that Fred prefers attacking to maintaining the status quo and prefers maintaining the status quo to withdrawing. How can Fred get attack, right? How can Fred be able to sort of push us to getting attack, right? How is he able to accomplish that? Let's go through the exercise. If Fred is president, Fred can have proposal power. Fred sets the agenda, right? The public doesn't vote on all three of these at once. Fred can tell you, because he is president, these are the issues we're going to vote on. These are the choices we're going to make. So Fred, if he's going to achieve his top option, which is to attack, offers only two options, right? He says the United States can either attack Iran or the United States can maintain the status quo. Because he is president, Fred can take the option of withdrawal off the table. So if we're only choosing between attack or maintaining the status quo, we can see Fred is going to vote for attack over maintaining the status quo. Wilma doesn't, but Barney does. And by proposing that and proposing these and restricting these options, Fred has effectively engineered the outcome that he wants if he has proposal power. With those alternatives, we get a stable collective choice. We get attack is greater than the status quo, and therefore the United States can attack. So let's think about the implication of that. Collectively, if everybody is equal, we get no rational, transitive social choice. If we allow for one of these voters to be non-equal, if we allow for one of these voters to propose things, they don't even have to be a dictator. If they're just allowed to propose what the alternatives are, we do get a collective social choice. What this tells us is that we are observing something called structure-induced equilibrium. Now, if we go through the details of structure-induced equilibrium, this was a concept in rationalist choice on economics and rationalist choice on political science. And it's really it's really abstract, so I don't want to go through all the details of it, but the insight of it is that if we try to examine how mass publics can make collective choices, one way we can identify this are what are the rules? How do they make choices? Who gets to make proposal power? Who has veto power, right? Who gets to amend proposals? That procedure is going to lead us to an outcome where the public can make a collective social choice. And that's a stable social choice. And that stable social choice is what we would call structure-induced equilibrium. Now, in the United States, there are several institutions like this, right? There are voting systems. The way votes happen are restrictive. In the United States, votes tend to come down to two choices, right? Just because it's a majority rule system, it tends to be a binary choice between two political candidates, right? When those political candidates take office, they tend to present proposals to Americans in simplistic ways so you can make binary choices, right? So, for example, you can adopt something like single payer or you can maintain Obamacare. There are an infinite number of ways that healthcare in the United States can be modified, right? But it's useful for many politicians to present it in this way, to present it in this binary way that simplifies it down, right? And with that simplicity, people can make mass choices. You can go another way. Should you invade Iraq and tolerate weapons of mass destruction, or should you not? Right? It's a simplified choice. It's not even completely clear that that's accurate. Again, because there are millions of possibilities. There are millions of possible alternatives that the United States had in dealing with Iraq. But for simplicity, in order to allow the public to make a choice, it tends to be simplified down and distilled down. Right? Now, ask yourself, have you observed that? Do you see that? Right? Are there policies out there that you can see that tend to be simplified down in this way? Look at the U.S. response to China. Right? When it came time for the United States to challenge China on trade, it basically was, should the United States stand up to China or should the United States tolerate the status quo and continue to be suckered by China? Of course, there's an infinite number of possibilities in between. Of course, there's many, many intricacies in U.S. trade policy with China, but the way it is portrayed to the public in order to get a collective social choice is through simplistic means. What this means is that Americans generally, because they're very busy again, and because the agenda is being set in this way, they tend to rely very heavily on politicians' behavior to gain information. Politicians, presidents in particular, set the agenda and they set the number of choices. Based on that, the United States is able to observe the choice. Americans are able to observe the choices, typically filtered through a mass media. Right, and based on that agenda and the choices that are presented, Americans can form a preference ordering that can be non-dictatorial, right? But elites are setting the agenda. The public then identifies and makes choices between the options in the agenda. But remember, and since this is important, the agenda is revealed and presented strategically in order to maximize support for elite positions. When we say that the president is very powerful in American foreign policy, remember, the president has the agenda power. So the president is going to present foreign policy issues in a way that are typically engineered to gain support. It's no secret that the president typically gains quite a bit of support in foreign policy. They're the ones setting the agenda, and they present it in a way that's going to maximize their support within the American public. So let's take an example. Let's look at U.S. behavior towards Iraq. Right now, when the Bush administration made its decision to invade Iraq, it presented Americans with a choice. The United States could invade and depose Saddam Hussein, or it could do nothing. And if it did nothing, it was only a matter of time before Americans saw another 9/11, right? Before another terrorist attack happened, before Saddam Hussein armed terrorists and provided them with weapons of mass destruction. The idea that Saddam did not have weapons of mass destruction and was far away, that was off the table. Nobody thought about that, right? And again, to be perfectly transparent about this, at the time I was working as a graduate student in Rice University. I was participating in the Correlates of War project. I was coding data on Iraq. So I was collecting incidents about Iraq, and I basically had gone through every single military encounter the West had had with Saddam Hussein. I knew quite a bit about him. I knew quite a bit about his military capability. I had investigated it quite thoroughly. I was fairly convinced, and when I say fairly, I really mean completely convinced that he had these things, that he had weapons of mass destruction. And again, that's based on looking at a whole lot of data. That's based on following this case quite closely. I was convinced he had them. So it wasn't, I don't like to think of myself as completely dumb. That may apply sometimes, right? But in that case, based on educated information, based on following the case, based on tracking the case, I was convinced. Turned out there was an actor named Sean Penn who said that Iraq never had weapons of mass destruction. He was right and I was wrong on that, to my shame. But again, what you would like to think about is that when it came to Iraq, if Sean Penn and I made judgments on Iraq 1,000 times, I would be right a whole lot more than Sean Penn because I was well educated when it came to Iraq. Nonetheless, let me spare myself some future embarrassment. We can go back to the subject at hand. The point of this is that even if you were educated, even if you were not educated, if you were able to portray the decision in a simplistic binary way, you can get a majority that will support the policy that you wanted. And when it came to the Bush administration in Iraq, the policy that they wanted was to topple the regime of Saddam Hussein. You could portray that in a way. Do you want to topple Saddam Hussein and have the United States keep the initiative? The war starts at a time of Americans choosing, or do you want to wait until Saddam arms a terrorist organization and you get an attack? And you'd have to do the same thing anyway. Portray it that way. 2 years after 9/11, when the smoke is still rising from the World Trade Center, I think you could get a pretty simple majority that would support the invasion of Iraq. And the Bush administration did, right? It certainly did. Now, the flip side of that is that the Democrats, when they were competing with this, many of them jumped on board support for the Iraq invasion. Many of them did. Some of them tried to create other binary choices that the Bush administration could drag the United States into war or it could work with the UN. They simplified that down. They took do nothing off the table, take that off the table completely. Inspections or war, United Nations or war, portray it that way, right? They couldn't get a majority for that, but they could at least have some bit of support for their positions by portraying things in this way. Now, again, let's talk reality. There was an infinite number of choices that the United States had when it came to Iraq. As an example, since as the road was heading down to war, someone in or a group of, again, this is based on some reporting, a group of Baathists, which were the leading party in Iraq, approached an American political official named Richard Pearl about a proposal where they would basically certify that there was no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. They would allow for an American presence in Iraq, but all the instances they would allow for oil treaties to go to Iraq, to the United States, etc. But the United States had to allow the Ba'athist regime to survive. They would depose Saddam Hussein, but the Ba'athist regime had to survive. The United States said no to that, with the argument Richard Pearl made the case that if these Baathists were really serious, they wouldn't have approached him. They would have gone to somebody else. Point being, think about that alternative. Would you prefer that? Would you prefer basically allowing the Baathists to depose Saddam Hussein, they stay in power, they maintain territorial integrity over Iraq, but Saddam's gone? Would you have preferred that alternative? That alternative was never discussed. The way it was portrayed to the United States was you had to invade or there was going to be a terrorist attack, right? And that got support for the agenda, right? That got support for what the Bush administration was trying to do. So the question is, if it's the case that the presidency is leading the agenda and has such an influence over the agenda, are the public basically sheep? Are they basically just following what the president does? Well, no, right? This is something that distinguishes democracies from non-democracies, right? If it's a non-democracy, the public will just follow what the agenda setter wants, and that's the end of it. But in the United States and in democracies, it's true the public will have to choose between these alternatives. But as part of making these alternatives, politicians promise things. You promise that if the United States attacks Iraq, US safety will be better, right? Americans will be more secure, Americans will be safer. The public tends to listen to those statements. Those statements tend to be not internalized, but they're written down, right? They're public. If those predictions materialize, the public can think, okay, the politician knows what they're doing. If those promises don't materialize, if those predictions don't materialize, there's a moment for retrospective evaluation, right? Some Americans may just stick to their initial choice, right? If they chose to believe President Bush, and they said that the war in Iraq would make them safer, and they start to see significant American casualties, and there's more instability in Iraq, they'll still believe Bush, right? They'll still hold on to that. But there are many Americans that will make a retrospective evaluation. Bush promised that the United States would be safer and that terrorism would go down if the United States invaded and toppled Saddam Hussein. Terrorism, unquestioningly, did not go down. Right after the war on terror after the Operation Iraqi Freedom was initiated, terrorism went up. Based on looking at that, you could conclude that Bush did not do what he said he was going to do, that his performance in foreign policy was not successful. Now, again, to be bipartisan about this, the Obama administration promised that it was going to pursue a different path in the Middle East, and that their path was going to be better than the Bush administration's path, and that they were going to extricate the United States from Middle Eastern wars. 2014 rolls around and ISIS emerges in Syria and Iraq and takes Mosul and starts to emerge as a significant force within Iraq. That would lead many Americans to look at the Obama administration and say, you promised that there wouldn't be any more American involvement in Iraq. The United States is now deepening its involvement in Iraq after leaving. You are also an incompetent foreign policy leader, right? So if the observed outcome is a failure or deviates from promises that are made by political leaders, that's a moment where the public, if they choose to, can punish the incumbent leader, right? They can punish the incumbent leader by voting against them or by not voting at all, right? If you're a hardcore supporter of the Bush administration and you observe the outcome in Iraq and you aren't happy about that, but you couldn't bring yourself to vote for a Democrat, you just stay home, which has the same effect of weakening Bush's coalition, weakening Bush's chances of being reelected. So let's look at another example of this outside of Iraq. Let's look at President Carter's campaign against Iran. Now, this was part of the Iran hostage crisis, where in 1979, Americans in large numbers were taken hostage inside the U.S. Embassy in Iran. This was a long policy standoff. 1980 was President Carter's election year. He was campaigning for re-election against his challenger, Ronald Reagan. On April 24th, 1980, with no progress or not sufficient progress being made to deal with Iran and to try to release the hostages, President Carter initiated this operation called Operation Eagle Claw, which was supposed to free the hostages in Iran. It had problems, right? There were equipment malfunctions, there was bad weather, and Carter was forced to abandon the mission. Based on that outcome, Carter was judged and continues to be judged as a foreign policy failure. Right? That's because Carter promised that he would free the hostages from Iran. Carter failed to free the hostages from Iran using military means. Clearly, he meant for the military mission to succeed, and it did not. That means that Carter is a foreign policy failure, right? Since this outcome shaped beliefs about Carter, that he was incompetent, that he was a failure, that he was a weak foreign policy leader, right? That's what it shaped about him. That's a little strange because, first of all, again, Carter didn't initiate the operation. Carter wasn't participating in the operation, so he was neither weak nor strong. He just said the operation should go forward. Carter also doesn't control equipment malfunctions. Had those equipment malfunctions not happened, had there not been bad weather and the mission succeeded, the view of Carter may have been very different in the future, right? And we can also look at Carter's behavior in terms of whether or not he's strong or not. He was the one that helped start the mission of arming the Mujahideen and fighting the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, which turned out to be something that the Reagan administration continued and ended up being very successful. So the point being, this is just a moment in time to look at President Carter and say he's weak on foreign policy. And yet the outcome of this mission shaped that belief and continues to shape that belief that Carter was weak on foreign policy, or at least incompetent on foreign policy. That's interesting. Again, Carter's history doesn't suggest he is either weak or strong or anything. He makes decisions just like any other politician. The outcome of this operation, because of retrospective evaluation, made Carter look like a weak foreign policy president, and I think it's fair to say helped cost him the election in 1980. So let's look at an alternative case. Let's look at the death of bin Laden. Similar to the Carter administration, the Obama administration decided to initiate an operation on foreign soil. No doubt about it. The administration was deeply concerned that if it failed, they would be another Carter administration. But this one went differently. So on May 2nd, 2011, the Obama administration initiated an operation called Neptune Spear. It attacked a compound in Pakistan believed to house Osama bin Laden. Initially, one of the helicopters did crash, but the SEALs were able to recover the operation, and they did kill bin Laden and retrieve the information, and retrieve troves of information that they didn't expect to achieve. So in a lot of ways, this operation went better than expected, and they made it out of Pakistan without any further incident. Based on this operation, Obama was viewed as a competent manager of foreign policy in the election campaign of 2012. This changes later with Benghazi and changes later with the rise of ISIS. But in this moment, he was looked at as a competent foreign policy manager. Now let's think about that again. Obama himself did not participate in this mission, right? He wasn't on the helicopters, right? He simply ordered it, right? What happens after that is out of his control. He just made that decision, right? And yet he was looked at as a successful foreign policy leader just because of what the SEALs did, right? And because of how the operation played out. That's consistent with this idea of retrospective evaluation. Obama had promised in the campaign that if he had an opportunity to take a shot at bin Laden, if there was actionable intelligence against bin Laden in Pakistan, he would do it. He executed this. It turned out to be successful. He looks like a successful foreign policy leader based on retrospective evaluation. That's kind of how the public does this, right? They basically will evaluate what was promised versus what is materializing in terms of outcomes. And then they can make decisions about competency. What they want in terms of policy is simplified down by politicians. But once politicians present policies to the public then has an opportunity to evaluate, did politicians actually execute that policy well? Are they competent managers of foreign policy? Right, so if we think about what public opinion is, there's a couple of key things to bear in mind. It doesn't come directly from Americans. It's translated into something coherent through institutions, right? Collectively, even though individual Americans are rational, collectively, right, assuming it's non-dictatorial, assuming it's based on voting, the American public won't come to something that has an ordered and transitive rational preference profile. But it can be made into a rational transitive preference profile through structure-induced equilibrium or through the filtering of institutions. So institutions aggregate you as public preferences into something coherent that can be helpful for policymakers in making decisions. However, the public typically can react, right? Even though their agendas are being constrained, even though their choices are being constrained and being strategically set by politicians, they can evaluate whether or not the politicians are performing competently. Are they actually executing? Are they actually achieving what they promised to achieve? And then they can make a judgment as to whether or not the politician should stay. Now, what we can see is that in order for the American public to pay attention, this is empirical, failures tend to have to be pretty highly profile. They have to be shocking. They have to be explosive, right? Just as an example of this, during the Iraq War, at some point in 2004, the media stopped reporting daily casualty counts. And so if an American died in the Iraq War, that was not seen as a high-profile failure. But that wasn't true in the early stages of the Iraq War, right? In May of 2003, in June of 2003, July of 2003, when Americans were being reported as being killed in Iraq, the American public started seeing each of those as shocking and started seeing each of those as evidence that the Bush administration was failing. But at some point, that stopped getting the attention, right? It had to have that shock value to really make the Americans update their beliefs and see that policy is a failure or not, much like the Carter operation did, or much like the Obama administration did, or the Neptune Spear did. So it requires some high-profile shock to the Americans to get them to actually evaluate foreign policy. If they don't get that, oftentimes they'll just defer and just, in a sense, follow along with what elites are doing. Okay, so I'm going to stop this part of the lecture, and then I'll start the next one, which is the second segment is going to be about elites and interest groups, which is going to talk about how particularly organized interests can influence American policy.